Good evening, CU community. You're listening to WEFT 90.1. Welcome to In the Know, a public affairs show where social issues, trending topics, relevant research, and important perspectives are discussed so you, the listener, can be in the know. The opinions expressed on this show are those of the host and guests and not of WEFT. We're streaming live on Facebook. Listeners are welcome to submit comments and questions on the Facebook live stream, which you can find on my personal Facebook page, Sherry Williamson, or via Twitter at Nature79. This evening, we're going to be having a candid discussion on the show 13 Reasons Why, a show that raised a bit of controversy. Parents, others thought that it might glamorize the idea of suicide. So we have some guests in the studio who are going to help us kind of unpack this idea of teenage suicide. We have 4 guests tonight. We'll have them introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for having us this evening. My name is Staci McNicholl. I've been practicing in this community for 17 years. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. Worked at the Pavilion Hospital here in Champaign on the youth unit as a lead therapist. Worked in the assessment department as well as New Choice, kind of floated my way around. I also worked at the mental health center here in Champaign County at the respite center. And most recently, I have my own private practice here in Champaign.
Hi, I'm RJ McNicholl, and of course I also have a private practice here in town as a licensed clinical social worker. But my history with suicide and suicide prevention is that I supervised the crisis teams in the community for a number of years, as well as was the chair of the University of Illinois Suicide Prevention Program also for a number of years. And prior to that, the director of assessment at the Pavilion Hospital. So I spent a lot of time assessing and engaging with those with suicidal ideation and suicide attempts.
Hi, I'm Juli Kartel. I'm the Director of Clinical Services at Rosecrance here in Champaign. We're a community mental health and substance abuse treatment center. I've been in the field of behavioral health, which is generally known as both substance abuse and mental health work together. And I've worked in substance abuse and in mental health for over 20 years, worked with adolescents all the way through the age span. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor.
Hi, I'm Jolie Carsten, and I'm the clinical director with Elliott Counseling Group here in Champaign. I've been working in social services as a licensed clinical social worker for over 20 years in mental health, addiction, child welfare, criminal justice. So suicidality has been a part of something I've dealt with in various settings.
Great, thank you guys for being here. So we'll just get right into it. Those who have watched the show 13 Reasons Why, what was your first impression after watching it?
After watching it, my thought was that it had a lot of realistic components to it, and that there were a lot of things in it that were, yes, although raw and very provocative in presentation, they were very real, and I think a very real experience for many teenagers in our world today.
RJ and I actually watched it with our teen girls, and they were just telling us that it was realistic. This is how real life happens, and I think it can be really difficult because it puts reality in the forefront and it doesn't look away. It provides an unflinching view of what happens in a teenager's world.
I was introduced to the show by my 14-year-old daughter, and we watched some episodes together, and the ones we didn't watch together, she would discuss with me and fill me in. And she felt similar to what Staci and RJ were saying, that the concepts that were being put forth in the show were familiar to her from her peers.
So I know right before we went on air, we were talking about how facilitating this conversation isn't necessarily scary for youth. They seem to think they have a great handle on it, but for parents, it can be really hard and frightening to bring up the topic of suicide for a variety of reasons. Why do you think that conversation is so hard for parents to facilitate?
Well, there's probably a whole host of reasons that we could all address. I think one of the misconceptions many people have is that if you just even bring up the topic of suicide, that you're planting a seed for somebody to actually carry out the act, and it's really not the case. Usually when you talk about suicide, or if you bring up the topic, it actually gives more hope for individuals who might be actually contemplating that. They want an opportunity to talk, and it gives them much more hope than it does at all planting a seed. That doesn't happen. That's just not the case.
So it's creating a safe space versus encouraging an idea. So it's not taboo in the household to have this discussion because now your parent has said, let's talk about this topic?
Yeah, I think adults in general, we tend to be uncomfortable with any emotions other than happiness in children. And as soon as they're unhappy, we want to figure out a way to get them happy. And I think unintentionally, that communicates that all emotions except for happiness are negative or bad.
That's a really good point. Very good point.
And I think on top of that, the reality is that we're afraid of what the answers are going to be when we get them. As parents, we don't want any of our children to be Hannah Baker. We don't want any of our children to experience the things that she experienced throughout the show. And so the concern is, what do we do with the answers that we get? We want the questions, we want the information, but then how do we interact once we have it? And I think that's the big concern, and that's scary for parents.
Mm-hmm. So for those of you who have watched it, do you think it glamorized suicide?
I actually watched, there's like this little clip or a segment, about a 20-minute segment after the last tape, in which the producers, Brian Yorkie, as well as Selena Gomez, kind of talk about their perspective on it. And Brian said that his goal was to really have kind of a raw view, and that to do anything else would be doing it a disservice. I think the last episode where we see Hannah in the bathtub and she has a razor to her wrist, yeah, it's pretty graphic. But what comes after that is we get to see how it's not like she just goes away peacefully. There's pain. There's a lot of struggling. Her mom walks in. I mean, there's a whole host of things that happen. So I think in a lot of ways it shows what happens after that. It's not this magical, mystical moment. There are real consequences that occur after this.
I think it does a good job with giving you, kind of like Julie said, there's so many variables when it comes to mental health and all different facets of it. But it gives you an idea of, from a youth perspective, what could lead up to this idea that suicide is the option, or just the only option. These tapes that she's giving to people to say, here's how you contributed to this. This gives you that perspective from, a teen's point of view. This is how it impacted me. Like Staci was saying, I've processed this, and this is the conclusion that I came to.
Well, I don't necessarily think that it glamorizes it, but I think that there is possibly some unintentional support of some themes that people who are depressed, and especially adolescents who are, their brains are still developing the ability to think things through rationally and abstractly. Themes like feeling like exactly what you said, like this is the only way out. Rather than being able to problem solve in other things or reach out to other people. And in addition to that idea that, in a sense, she gained popularity by everybody talking about her, and people who, a lot of times this happens in real life too, when some sort of tragic event happens to one person, people who weren't directly knowledgeable of them or weren't maybe like their best friends, suddenly they're talking about them. Suddenly they are, talking about all the good things about them, and they become, in a sense, popular. Mm-hmm. So it could have unintentionally brought that up for some kids' minds.
Mm-hmm. So some of the news articles that I looked at said that we've seen a rise in suicide for teenage girls, as well as teenage boys, but not quite to the same rate. Why do you think that's happened?
That's an interesting question, interesting statistic. I mean, suicide has been the number 2 cause of death for teenagers for many, many years outside of car accidents. And what's important about that to know is that, what I think is happening is being reported more. It's being talked about more. It's more of a discussion. So it's not necessarily that they've increased in terms of maybe numbers. It could be that it's being reported more often. It's being talked about. Actually when it's happening, doctors, coroners, things like that are actually labeling it as suicide as opposed to other causes historically that they may have tried to avoid it, because it's now a topic in a discussion that is more comfortable for people to discuss.
I think, too, if we look at the depression rates, those are up 50% over the last 11 years. I think, a couple of things we can look at here overall with boys and girls is use of SSRIs. There's some discussion about whether there's an increase of suicidal thoughts with using that medication. I think social media plays a huge part in this. If we look at Twitter, we look at all of the online, chat sites and things that teens have access to, there's just incredible pressure to present yourself as perfect. This extends even outside of the school. So all these standards and ideals are pressing on girls, especially for those standards to be beautiful, to be perfect, to have everything. And there's this image almost that's created online for girls. And I think that's really, really tough for teens to struggle with. So there's just huge standards. also, along with that, everything is instant, right? We get instant access on our phones, and I think that's really difficult to sit with some of those uncomfortable feelings and emotions.
So when you're talking about technology, obviously, we're all kind of incorporating that somewhere in our lives, especially with social media, or I found with my 11-year-old, there are tons of different apps that you can connect with your friends, ones I'd never even heard of. How do you think, though, that works when you have cyberbullying going on? So you, like you said, it's instantaneous. Somebody puts something mean out there. It's with you. A lot of times I see, for instance, her engaging in group chats, and so now it's almost like somebody's being roasted. And so how do you think technology has played into this increase in suicide?
I think one of the things, and again, this is all speculation because there's no research yet to say these are the causes. They are all speculations, but I think they all play some role in it. And I think, technology gives us many wonderful things, as well as resources and information about how to access resources for something like this that you might need additional help. But I certainly see it with my teen, and I'm sure all the parents here can shake their head, is that we also know that it begins to isolate your children. They become very isolated. I know it with my child. She's in a room and she's isolated, and she might be studying. The next thing I see, she's on her phone. And so the isolation within themselves, where they could be watching what's going on and what's being said in social media that could be negative. And then the isolation perhaps from parents, where you might, before in my day, my parents could hear my phone conversations and could intervene. We don't have that kind of luxury anymore. So I think there's a greater isolation that can happen, and I think there's a greater blending of sort of reality and this other world that happens online that can become problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can isolate easily. I mean, we see adults doing that. We isolate depression, isolation. All of a sudden, you've kind of created your own bubble. Within that bubble, you're safe. And you get to choose who comes into that world. And so, unfortunately, you have people who are toxic who might come into that world. Our teens, like we've said before, may not know how to process that or how to push back or set those boundaries. So what recommendation would you give to a parent? I know we hear all the time, limit screen time. That's, cliche at this point. But it obviously sounds like it is an important, topic to talk to your students about not isolating like that.
Well, I think one thing you have to pay attention to is that, for many people in the past, they would leave school and that's where it would end. Right? Bullying would end at school and you'd be able to come home and there'd be a reprieve. But now it's not a reprieve. It's a 24-hour constant bullying. So if somebody's bullied at school or something happens at school, it extends past the school day into the evening, into their other activities, onto social media, all the way through the night. So it's a never-ending experience. And so there has to be some boundaries for parents to establish that reprieve for people, sometimes for students, to say, look, we understand that that's a social connection for you, but we also want you to connect to your family, connect to your community in a way that it doesn't feel like a constant experience for them, because if not, then it's a forever experience and it doesn't stop, and that can be really heavy for kids.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, even though the less screen time is cliche, it is really important because, in a sense, the more screen time you have, the less human time you have.
Yeah. And I think, as you've mentioned before, that also means, like Julie was saying, your student is isolated from you as a family, and so you're not, as a parent, able to connect with them or even really gauge if bullying is happening in the first place, if it is happening, what degree is it happening, who's involved with it. I think it can sometimes be easy for parents, especially now, to say, oh, well, they have it under control. They'll come to me if they, have a problem with bullying, which we know isn't true. You don't want to be that child who tells on another student and now it's escalated because you don't know how the bully is going to have, their recourse with the situation. So yeah, I think it's important, like you were saying, that we have better ways for parents to engage consistently every day. I know one parent said that they make sure that screens are off, they're at the dinner table, they're engaging, they're talking. They know at least for that hour that they are connecting with their student in some way.
I think that is really one of the key things. If we want our kids to have less screen time, it means parents have to get off the screens.
I was having this conversation with somebody over lunch, and they were saying, this is cyclical. Mental health is cyclical. You're looking at just behaviors. If parents isolate, like you were saying, students, that's just the way they're going to be at a certain age anyways. And so now you have this behavior that's of the family. We don't talk about mental health, or you can go do this, or it's okay if my child is out until 11 o'clock at night on a school night. You have all these cyclical behaviors that you see in families. So the parent basically said it can be hard to stop that behavior. This is what worked for me, even though they do say that with some hesitation that they're not sure it really worked, but it is what happened in their household. So for parents who say, I don't know how to connect to my children, what are some suggestions that you can offer on, even if it's just 15 minutes to check in with their students?
So I think the really interesting part about the show is that none of those kids' parents really knew what was going on underneath. If we think about Bryce, whose parents were forever absent, he was home alone. If we think about Tyler, who presented a certain image to his parents and then was something else entirely when he was out. Same thing with Jessica. None of their parents really knew what was going on. A recent study has shown that 90% of suicidal youth feel their families don't understand them. And then conversely, studies show that 86% of parents were unaware of their child's suicidal behavior. So obviously we have a problem. Most kids say that they are more comfortable discussing their suicidal thoughts with a peer than with a staff member or with a parent. So I think some of those peer support groups can be really important, having other adults in their life. I think too, one of the things I saw from the show is there's a lot of like subtle code words used. I mean, Hannah never came out and said, oh yeah, I'm totally going to commit suicide. She used a lot of code words, and especially in that last episode with Mr. Porter, you had to watch pretty carefully to pick up on what she was saying. I think sometimes as parents, we need to be doing that as well.
I think also as parents, especially teenagers, we, really go back and forth between being a parent and being their friend and wanting to be their, cohorted sometimes. In reality, we have to maintain that parent responsibility and push through some of the very difficult conversations and not give up on them. Our kids are not going to talk to us in that first conversation, but it's the third, the fourth, the fifth. And my hope, having teenage girls, my hope is that when they're in a difficult position, that some conversation that we had throughout their life plays back in their head and they know they can come to me for a discussion. But it may not happen in the enlightenment of one conversation, but it's the series of conversations that they build trust with us.
Yeah, building on what RJ said, those 15 minutes, it's important to make sure that that's not you coming in with an agenda, that you're talking about things that are important to your child. I mean, if you used to watch Good Luck Charlie and talk about that with your child, then maybe they'll watch 13 Reasons Why and talk about that with you. You have to build upon, you have to talk about the little things in order for them to be willing to talk about the big things.
That is a very good point. But all three of you have shared good points. With my daughter, a lot of times it's, a lot of chatter about what happened at school, and sometimes I'm struggling to find, okay, where's she going with this? But like you said, the whole thing is where she's going with it. That's what she's communicating to me. Within those pieces, she's saying, this is the type of relationship I have with this person, or this is the type of relationship I have with the teacher, or this is just the overall general feeling I have about myself when I'm at school. So I think you're right. You have to listen for those very subtle points that they're trying to convey to you, even if it takes going all the way around the block and a half for them to get to that spot.
I think along the same thing that everyone has said is, that question about how do I talk to my child about this, or a child about depression or suicide. And we have to also remember as parents, we're their initial emotional coach. We have to coach them from the very beginning, from birth. And I always like to say you start having that conversation with them at birth, because you just have conversations like you've all said. They don't have to be the big conversations, but if mom or dad gets frustrated, we label it. Yeah, I'm frustrated and I'm struggling right now. I'm a little bit angry, but I'm going to take a break. Then you're being an emotional coach, and in your house, it's okay to say, I'm frustrated or I'm angry, and we can talk about it. So I think it's really important that emotions, labeling them, talking about them, owning them, not labeling them as crazy or out of control, early on in life opens the door for maybe these more challenging conversations as they get older.
Yeah, definitely. I read an article that said, even from their earliest days, massaging your child and having that physical connection with them is so vital, because again, when we have this non-organic way of communicating where, a friend of mine even said, her daughter will text her from her upstairs room. Okay, why is that even happening? But, then throughout the conversation, I said, well, when was the last time you hugged your child? And she actually had to pause and say, I'm not sure. But the article said, it's that physical touch that starts to build that safety, that starts to, have the child realize they can depend on you. There's that closeness. And the article went on to say, we're seeing parents who have disconnected. they let their children isolate. They're not hugging them. They're not giving them a kiss on the forehead. They're not, using those 15 minutes to connect with them and more than just verbal. And so it becomes kind of impersonal. One student who I talked to is a friend of my daughter. She said, well, I talked to my dad. He doesn't really care. It's just, he kind of is there. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? And she said, I just wish he would pay more attention to me. And that's really, really hard to hear. But I've had my own child check me on that and say, put your phone down, pay attention to me. I drug her out to the drive-in on Friday night, something she'd never done, but it was just a way to connect. So we had a chance to talk about whatever came up. When we talk about, having those 15 minutes, if a parent wants to really start breaching this topic of suicide, I know it can be scary, but what would you say to a parent who wants to try to have this conversation?
Well, I think, don't dance around it. Have a conversation. Kids are the best, and especially teenagers are the best, at knowing when you're uncomfortable and knowing when they've got control. And so don't be afraid to have the conversation. Have it at a time when you feel like, they're going to listen and they're going to hear me. Take them to dinner, have a one-on-one date with them, do whatever it is, but don't be afraid of the conversation, because as soon as they smell fear is when they're going to say, you're not serious about this, or you don't really want to know what I have to say to you.
Yeah.
Because what they're afraid of is that they're going to share something and they're going to get in trouble in some way, or that you're going to respond so overwhelmingly that they're not going to share anything with you again. And so what's important is to hear it, but to listen and to be okay with what you hear and use that as a jumping off point of discussion rather than a place to intervene all the time. Now, of course, if there is a reason to intervene to keep someone safe, you need to do that. But much of the time, you just need to listen and take that opportunity to get to know your child.
One of the episodes, she disclosed to the counselor at school that something had happened to her, and the overall thought was, he downplayed it. He didn't take it seriously. So, Staci was saying that wasn't just a cue. That was actually a disclosure. You couldn't get more obvious than that. And so, I think we mentioned before we went on air that sometimes it's hard to hear those answers. So when you have a parent who has taken that step and they've facilitated the conversation, and now they get to hear the hard truth that, yes, I've considered taking my own life, and then the shock happens. What can you tell a parent to move through that other than take a deep breath?
Take a deep breath and take another deep breath, and then validate what that child has just said. You really have to validate their feelings, whatever they express. That's going to be so important. If you don't validate in a calm and controlled way as much as you can, because, as parents, we'll be impacted by that also. But we have to find our own support outside of our children and try and validate them, let them know you love them, you care about them, and ask how you can help, that you want to help, that you're going to find help. I think all that's really, really important. But we as parents, if we hear that, have to also have our own emotions kind of in check at that moment and be ready and have our own support system in place.
Do you think there is kind of a way, like you were saying, we're not going to use our child to have that processing for ourselves. We have to do that outside of that conversation. Do you think there are ways that parents can seek support prior to having the conversation? Maybe checking in with a friend saying, I'm about to have this conversation, just kind of, have that exchange with somebody else. Do you think that could be something that could support a parent?
I do think it really would be helpful. In my own private practice, I've actually had several teenagers who've watched this show and unbeknownst to their parents who've come in and processed with me. So I think it would really be great for parents to kind of keep up on, watch this show, make sure you know what's going on, know what social media is out there, know what the kids are talking about and what they're doing. That way you have the right information to ask in terms of questions to your child.
So when you have this, conversation, your student discloses, from then on, I think we try to compartmentalize everything and try to isolate different things. Okay, well, I had this conversation about, drugs, we're done. How do you sustain this conversation now? Because this isn't a one and done type of thing where your child disclosed this. This is actually the beginning of conversation versus, well, now I know what I needed to know and we can move on from it, which in some cases, unfortunately, I think does lead to denial. I heard it, I know it happened, but I can't process, or I don't have the right support system to process this as a parent. So we're just going to hope that my student never has this thought again. So how do parents sustain that conversation?
I think if If a parent is just sort of jumping into this and they haven't had the opportunity to really build that foundation, and now they're like, okay, I kind of see that and I want to do this. Sometimes you need to get support for that, whether that's through counseling, whether that's through some type of other support group, or creating your own, neighborhood support group, or at a church or whatever. But being willing to not, a lot of times parents with very good intentions, they want their child to get help, so they will bring them to counseling. Mm-hmm. And what could be even more valuable is that parent getting some counseling to be able to know how to better communicate with their child, to know how to better manage their own emotions so that they can model that. And then maybe some family counseling as well to be able to work on those communication skills. A lot of times we're willing to teach kids how to ride a bike and how to do math, and we forget that we have to teach them social skills. We have to teach them emotional regulation skills, and so it's not just something that we automatically know how to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember this was quite a few years ago. I was attending one of the Champaign Community Coalition meetings, and we were talking about mental health. And one of my thoughts was, it's great that we allocate services and resources for students, but a lot of times what we're seeing is unchecked or undiagnosed mental health within the family somewhere. A parent has it. So how do you think this can affect a parent who now they're having to face this situation head on? They're being confronted by some type of mental health within their home, but then they may start to realize, okay, this is caused by depression, or they're seeing depression in themselves. So when you talk about resources, when parents are having this conversation and they realize, hey, I may suffer from depression, or what I'm seeing in my child is too far of a cry from the behavior I'm exhibiting. How do you help parents then, again, not only just to have care for their child, but then to have self-care?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because a lot of times too, these things they may have experienced themselves, and they don't want to disclose that to their children for some reason or another. And so they're dealing with not only hiding that experience for themselves, but then dealing with the information they've been given. And so I think when that happens and you feel that as a parent, you have to say, my responsibility is to take care of myself, to be a good example of managing my mental health, of talking about this. And this is an opportunity to do this. And, they may feel some guilt and some shame for having held on to it for so long, but it's important for them to seek that help through a counselor, through a friend, through a church member, whatever it is, to really help process through those emotions so they can have a realistic conversation with their children about the things they've gone through. And it's okay to share not all, but some of those details with them about understanding the experience. And I think as a parent, if you don't follow up after an initial conversation, the message you're sending to your children is, thank you for the information, but I'm not going to do anything. I don't care. Right. And so even though maybe it's uncomfortable, you have to continue that conversation and follow up and let them know that you're not going to stop having a conversation. They're going to stop asking them about what's going on in their lives.
I looked at it. There was an email that I saved that talked about 5 things to know about parental depression. One of the things it said was, when left unaddressed, parental depression can undermine healthy parenting. Untreated parental depression can have harmful consequences on the children. Treatment for depression is usually effective, yet rarely addresses depression's potential impacts on parenting or children. A number of interventions have shown promise for improving outcomes among children with a depressed parent. And then the federal government obviously can play a leadership role in encouraging and facilitating comprehensive 2-generation approaches to treating parental depression. So obviously we know that if it's in the home, it's exhibiting itself in some way, shape, or form. Children are, receiving that, their perceptions of what's going on with their parent. I think one parent who I talked to was very candid, saying that, she knew her depression was undermining her parenting, because she would say one thing and then, like you were saying, check out. It's basically do as I say, not as I do. And when you have a topic as serious as suicide, you want to make sure that you're laying that groundwork. But, it's hard to do if the parent has depression. In general, when you're talking about facilitating this conversation and we're trying to sustain it, again, kind of going back to what we talked about before, what are ways that we can really check in with our students? What are ways that you would encourage a client or a patient who comes to you and says, I'm not connected to my child, I don't suspect suicide, but I know that this is about the age where their minds are going a little crazy, their hormones are going a little haywire. So how do I check in with them in a productive way, not just, hey, how's it going? And then, like RJ said, then you check out.
I think one of the challenges we have with adolescence is that the adolescent mind is still developing, like you had said, and much of the adolescent behavior that is normal adolescent behavior can also mimic something that could be of a concern. And so it is hard as parents to know, is this typical adolescent behavior or is this a troubled adolescent behavior? And really, hopefully your parent, as a parent, you kind of know maybe when things seem off with your child. And unfortunately, stigma on mental health in this country has done us not a service at all. It makes this conversation hard, why we're having to have these kinds of conversations, because it's so stigmatized. But I think it's important for parents at all times just to check in with their child and observe what they notice, say what they notice. And it doesn't always have to be when something bad is happening. But if they're noticing, wow, you're just, today seems like you're bright and happy today. Tell me about your day, what went on today. Or when something else is different, it doesn't always have to be this serious conversation. Like my children say, when I'm in the car with you, I know something's coming up. And so I had to pay attention to that so that, I needed to have conversations different ways and different topics. Not just the serious, now I'm going to have to ask my child a hard conversation. And the more we do that, I think the easier it will be.
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of somewhat easy ways to get that started and make those routines in your house is to, whether it's at dinner time or it's at bedtime or whatever, but have a set routine in which, you have a conversation. I saw these really cool napkins at the store that we bought and put on our table that each had like funny little questions you could ask. So like if everybody has a napkin at dinner, you'd read yours out loud and then everybody gets to ask that. Or like do funny little word games. So like what Julie's saying, it doesn't always have to be a serious conversation, but the routine of talking becomes something. Plus, having like a weekly family meeting is a really great idea in which everybody, you can have like a paper on your fridge or, magneted to the wall or something where anybody can write something down for that week's agenda, and everybody gets to take a turn leading it so that it creates this routine of that, we're a team and we talk and it gives everybody a chance to be a leader in that.
That's a great idea. And I think that can also help give them that opportunity to start practicing how they verbalize, their feelings and their thoughts. Because now they're being tasked with, this is your week. You get a chance to kind of express whatever it is they, you feel is a priority. What types of things do you and Staci do to connect with your twins?
I think one of the biggest things is using natural moments so that we don't always have to create this big, thing to have this conversation, but using natural moments, whether it's when you're saying goodnight, whether it's when you're on the drive home from some activity, whether it's you're running to the store, you're cooking dinner together, but use the natural moments to start a conversation and ask how their day was. That's a simple question. Ask how their day was. How was your day today? How did things go? And they'll talk. They'll talk when they're not going to initiate that conversation with you, but they're going to talk when you initiate the conversation and push and don't let them be quiet. We get so caught up in saying, well, we want to give them independence and we want to allow them to be their own person, and we do. But sometimes we don't need to allow them to be quiet. And we need to kind of push that conversation, really teach them to engage. So natural moments, and they happen all day. So utilize them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, can probably be the difficult point when you have a parent who's suffering with mental health, when they have their own depression. It can be hard to reach out organically. Even when you have a child who's willing to give you information, I think it can be hard to process it because now you're having to push yourself out of this comfort zone that you created. So, that is one thing, I know keep coming back to, but I hear it when I talk to parents that they're saying they recognize that they have mental health issues going on. And so how do I do this? How do I, really, like you were saying, don't ignore it. Don't just, here's what you said, now we move on. But when they're not able to control their own, essentially what's going on with them, and they're not able to find coping skills to deal with their depressions, or the ones that they do, like the article was saying, undermines their parenting, I think it can be hard even when they have that opportunity that's just kind of being gifted to them, handed over, where their student is giving them that chance, they're not, taking advantage of it. So we've talked about, stigma and how that can be a a difficult thing for anybody to, even mental health professionals I know have to deal with that stigma with their clients, with the work that they do, community outreach. So how do we start addressing that? I know that's the $1 million question, how do we get past stigma? How do we have these conversations where people understand that? I think what the statistic was 1 out of 4 adults. And so how do we get people to understand this is more common than you think it is?
So I think the first thing is, in episode 12, Mr. Porter definitely does a disservice when he is talking with Hannah about the assault that's happened. And I think that really does the whole profession a huge disservice. She was dropping so many clues and signs. And so I think kind of the first thing that we would need to look at is, are there other resources that can help? If we think about this, is there a therapist that the parent can reach out to? Is there some training that the parent can get in a particular way? I think as professionals, we have to be open and talking about it. This was such an important show to be made because it allows the conversation to be had. I think no discussion is really bad because the ideas are there, the kids are getting it. It's not just one idea about suicide or one picture that promotes that idea. There's already some underlying pathology that's going on that this has now contributed to. So I think really opening up that discussion, that's why this film series was so important, because it allows for the discussion to be had. And I think that's how we reduce stigma, is by having these conversations, by having that one-on-one with our kids, by really putting out there how this actually affects people.
Mm-hmm. And I think if we can continue, because of the impact of stigma, we do not treat physical health diseases with the same kind of shame and blame that we do mental health. And many mental health conditions are brain conditions, and science just hasn't caught up. It's much further along than it used to be, and we can now identify many more diseases as brain diseases that are mental health concerns. And so, we still have this shame around mental health, like it's a choice or it's some kind of moral failure. And we know more and more now that that's not the case. So if we can begin to see mental health and physical health as the same thing, you wouldn't shame somebody with cancer or diabetes like we shame people with depression or anxiety or suicidal thoughts. And so I think it's really important that we continue to have conversations like these. And I think more and more recently we've had famous people publicly speaking, which I think helps begin to normalize that we all have mental health challenges at various parts in our life and at various degrees, and that's a part of life. Mm-hmm. And so we need to continue to speak up and normalize it and not make it something that's just viewed as a moral failing.
Yeah, one of the movies that I remember watching was Girl Interrupted. And when the main character, Winona Ryder, went in with her therapist and her parents, they were saying, oh, she has borderline personality disorder. And this normally comes down hereditary from the mother. And the mother just freaks out. Well, I didn't do this. I didn't make her the way that she is. So you have stigma right there, mm-hmm. where when we do have science catching up and saying this is just something that gives you a predisposition, like we've found out with alcoholism, mm-hmm. I think there's that shame of, well, I didn't do this to my child. This wasn't me. This wasn't my genes. I didn't do this. So there's so many different ways we're hit with stigma, mm-hmm. and you're ignoring, like you said, the fact that this is something biological happening to this person. And so why are we shaming?
This is true in postmortem studies, that there's reduced levels in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex in those with and without psychiatric conditions. So this isn't something that is done by a psychiatric condition. This is something that is across all who commit suicide.
Mm-hmm. Something really interesting, you ask about how to have that conversation, how to remove stigma. I'd ask people to challenge themselves a little bit and think about the last conversation you had with your friends, or when the last time you held each other accountable to how you're doing from a mental health component, and how you're doing and how you're feeling and how you're doing as a parent and how you're doing with the stress in your life. And I'm going to guarantee that the majority of people don't have that conversation even within their own friend groups as adults. Mm-hmm. And so we're asking our teens and we're asking these other people to talk with us about that, but we're not even talking about it ourselves. Mm-hmm. And to remove stigma, it starts with ourselves. It starts with us being comfortable with that conversation and being able to hold even the closest people to us accountable to how they're doing and being able to respond to those things.
And fitting in with that self-care piece, the airplane talk of, put on your oxygen mask first so right. that you can take care of other people. And there's this almost like a badge of honor for doing more for your kids than for yourself.
Mm.
And really, you're doing your kids a disservice if you're not taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I saw a picture on Facebook that said, how you thrive is dependent on how you create your tribe. So who you surround yourself with. I'm fortunate with the fact that I have a small group of friends, but they are ones who are very brutally honest with me when it comes to parenting or anything else. I know that I can talk to them, check in with them. I'm always excited about what they have to say, but I know that they're giving me a perspective that maybe I'm unwilling to see as a parent because, you're too close, obviously, to be able to have sometimes that unbiased, objective, conversation even with yourself. So we know that this is a series that kids have watched. We know that they are talking about it. So they're talking about it like when we were saying we talk to our peers, they're talking to their peers. So we're not tasking them with having, directing or guiding their peers, but we know they're talking about it. So how do we help them when they, they're having those conversations to have a healthy, not, promoting, ideas that their friends have that are incorrect? How do we help them so that they might have a little influence on their friends when it comes to making sure we're not having this conversation about suicide in a way that can be, obviously detrimental to, groups, individuals within those groups?
I think it's important for us as parents to try and learn as many facts that we can learn. The more that we understand what the facts are out there, I think the more we can educate our children as well. I know, my child has times where she's brought things up that have concerned her about some of her friends. And so I try and educate her in general about the issue. I try and coach her on ways that she might express her concern for the person, that it's not her responsibility to fix it and take it on, and suggestions about where the person might reach out for additional help. And so I think knowing the facts, being able to know where there are some resources, and being able to normalize that people have these thoughts and feelings, and that we can't suddenly freak out that our child tells us that they might be thinking about suicide. We might be freaking out internally. Externally, we keep it together, and we have the conversation and try and help them find the resources and know the facts.
I think something interesting we were talking about beforehand is also understanding what their definitions are. Mm-hmm. Understanding what suicide means to them, understanding what sexual assault means to them, understanding what the abuse of alcohol means to them. We have our definitions as adults and professionals, but what are our child's definitions? Many times, even when we talk to our own kids, they talk about being, dating someone or being in a relationship. What they're communicating is they're texting back and forth. They've never actually met each other. But until we get that definition, we're not on the same page.
Right.
And so we're talking about two very different things. Mm-hmm. And to some teenagers, they feel like we're out of touch because we're not working out the same definitions. So sometimes it's allowing them to educate us. And many times we try and do so much education that we don't take the time to let them educate us on their experience. And that can break the barrier of conversation a lot with teenagers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you mentioned earlier, they feel like, well, they don't understand us. My parents don't understand anything that's going on with me. Like you said, that's a very good point, that these worlds are, having to, collide with each other in some ways, but do you know what it means to be in their world? Do you know what it means to perceive, even, I talked to somebody, what bullying is, that has so many different definitions to it. So being able to have that conversation, like you said, to understand, I want to know how you look at suicide, or how you look at self-harm, or how you look at all of these other different things. But I think that also means we have to organically connect with their friends. Who are your students' friends? Your children have multiple friends. Like you said, sometimes they haven't even met them. They're just online. But who are they? Where are they? That also, goes into internet safety. But for the ones we know they go to school with, their parents. So if you go over to that house, what are you being exposed to? Because when we're talking about unchecked mental health, what are they seeing when they go into that household? And I think to some degree, parents have taken a step back from that. I mean, we don't quite have the neighbor, where you go to the school around the corner from your house anymore. So that does us a little bit of a disservice with connecting, but it's still the parent's obligation to do that, for their child, and know, okay, here's Susie, here's Susie's parents, I know exactly who they are, I feel comfortable with them. So if you have a student your child comes to you and says, well, Susie was talking about possibly hurting herself. Well, now it's not just this random crazy call that you're giving to Susie's parents. You have that relationship with them to say, I have this concern. And I think that just shows support to your student as well, because now you're showing them, I understand that this is what's going on, and I want to help you, and I want to help your friend. That's why I've taken it upon myself to have a relationship with their parent, or at the very least, have a familiarity with that parent. So, if you have parents who even suspect something like this, what resources should parents seek out and utilize if they suspect that their child is suicidal?
Well, on a national level, there's the National Suicide Hotline. It's 1-800-273-8255. The really cool part about that is there's an online chat that teens can do as well. You can also text. It's 741-741. They also have a Twitter address. It's 800-273-TALK. So there's quite a few resources there in ways that kids would utilize them that they could reach out to.
Yeah, and I think, even our local crisis lines, our local, mental health professionals, even talking with teachers and talking with, their school about, look, this is some concern, and getting to know that environment too. So there's resources all around us that we can utilize if we access them, but we can't be afraid to. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we're afraid to access them because, like Staci was mentioning, the National Suicide Hotline. Well, what happens when we call? Are they going to send an ambulance to our house? Are they going to take our kids to a mental health hospital and lock them up? And understanding what the real process is, and understanding that that's not the intent of people in support positions. The intent is to help provide some understanding and relief and guidance. So the first step for many is not that we're going to rush in and remove a child from the home or anything like that. We're going to provide as much support as possible. So it's good for parents to also understand what the processes are in case they need to utilize them, but to know that the first step is really just providing the support.
Mm-hmm. Even reaching out, say, to the school social worker at your child's school, and maybe connecting there could be some kind of group that they could get involved in. A lot of times school social workers will have like a lunchtime group or something like that for kids.
I think one other thing, that is really important too, though, is, we let our kids kind of go off and we let them spend the night at their friends and all those. But, how many times have we invited their friends to our homes? And how many times have we opened up our home to their friends and really been able to make it a safe space, not only for them, but for their friends as well? And that's extremely important, because it may not be our child who's experiencing that. It may be somebody else's, but they know that our home or our space is also safe. So we need to be able to open up our homes to our kids' friends as well.
So one of the kind of more unfortunate things I know that we see with mental health is just the affordability of it and the access. So even when the Affordable Care Act came through, states were given the option of buying into mental health services. A lot of people pushed back and thought that should be standard. We see mental health causing all of these other systems to kind of crumble and be overloaded because of unchecked or undiagnosed mental health. So if you have a parent, let's say, who has Medicaid, and a lot of places take private insurance, where can we even push them locally so that their student gets the services that they need?
Well, I know our agency, Rosecrance, is one of the larger agencies that takes Medicaid. I don't think we're the only one, but I think we're one of the larger ones. And the reality is we have a long wait list. It's very true. That's one of the frustrations. While access to insurance, but if you have Medicaid, it is hard to get in many places. And I think that's the case across the country for a whole host of reasons that I won't get into, but that's the reality. I know what we're trying to do, and I think others are as well, is we are trying to provide some of those mental health services in the school. So it makes it a little bit easier for access for kids, and I think for some of the families. But the need is still, there's a huge need that's unmet. So I think the combination of people that have private insurance that are able to get folks in, some are also able to take Medicaid or Medicare, but it is a challenge to the system in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it takes a little work in exploring, because there are agencies both in the social service field as well as in private who will do a sliding fee scale, so that, like, for example, we have a program called Bridging the Gap that provides low cost counseling for people who don't have insurance we accept or don't have insurance. So a lot of other agencies do that as well.
So obviously this is an issue, and I think there are a lot of people who agree it's an issue. Now that, of course, with social media and there being better access to headlines across the country, we probably see mental health playing a part in headlines, even if it's not obvious, it's not just spelled out. So how do you advocate? How do we work towards getting mental health to be a bigger priority, not just on the local level, but the state level, the federal level? And that is another $1 million question, but at some point you have to start working in that direction if you're even going to make small steps.
Well, I think you also have to pay attention to local laws, local government. You pay attention to bills that are going through, and really take some time to pay attention so you can advocate with your local politicians as they vote for those things and they're supportive. I mean, the more people that communicate to your local representatives that this is something our community needs, the more they're going to listen and vote in those directions. But that's the voice that you can have. And so part of it is educating yourself on the impact of some of the bills and some of the laws and some of the things that are moving through our local government that affects funding, that affects access to services.
Yeah, I think on a macro level, that's fantastic. And I think if we're looking on a more micro level as well, it begins with conversations and shows like this within our household where, if someone had type 1 diabetes, we certainly wouldn't stigmatize them in any way. But of course, when it comes to mental health, it's different. So it starts with checking our own attitudes and beliefs about this, really changing our approach and belief towards depression, anxiety. We didn't talk a lot about sexual assault, but about sexual assault as well. It really means training your boys as well. It's not just a girl's responsibility, but training your boys on how they can ask for consent, talk about those things. So I think on a micro level, it really comes down to each of us working and changing our own attitudes and beliefs.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if we're in denial that mental health exists, then what do we need to advocate for? There's nothing to advocate, no issues that we're seeing. I think this show, while it was hard for some people to, even teachers I had say, this was kind of hard for me to understand it existed, because now I know they're talking about it. And by they were saying the students are talking about this. But I think, we've determined that it's just regular ongoing discussions, not just with parents and children in the household, but everybody who's a stakeholder when it comes to mental health and our youth, because we have so many, different ways that these things play out in the general. If you kind of had one parting message for the parents when it comes to this show, what would each of you say to the parents who either haven't watched it, or they have watched it, or they're kind of right on that verge of having the conversation, but they're still not there yet? What would kind of be your final message to parents tonight?
My message would be saying nothing sends a pretty strong message.
So inaction is action.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And my message would be, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to have a conversation, and don't be afraid of the information you get. It can only be helpful to you.
I just would really encourage parents to reach out if they want to have this conversation but feel afraid to. Reach out and have some support and check in on how they might approach this conversation in a healthy, helpful way.
I'd say really start focusing on yourself in order to allow those conversations to happen. Back to the idea of labeling your emotions and making it a safe place to feel in your house.
Okay, and then could each of you just talk a little bit about your agency, so if parents who wanted to take services, they have that opportunity.
Yeah, so Staci and I own the Rock Counseling Group here in town, which is a private practice in which we provide a variety of mental health services, a lot of advocacy, family counseling, marriage counseling, teenage social skills. There's also just adjustment in life issues. And so we do a lot with our community, not only in an individual component, but also advocacy in the court system and things like that. And so our office is absolutely willing to engage with the majority of issues that people face.
Great, thanks.
And I'm with Rosecrance, and again, we provide services, mental health and substance abuse, as early as 5 years old and then on through the lifespan. And we have all kinds of services, including your traditional mental health counseling, office-based kind of counseling, but a lot of other services for adults and children as well. And all people need to do is call 398-8080, and we can try and link them up to what they might need or that their family might need.
Thanks.
At Elliott Counseling Group, we're a private practice group, and we have over 35 therapists with a variety of specialties, and we serve all ages and all issues and accept almost all insurances, and we have evening and weekend appointments as well.
Yeah, I want to definitely give a shout out to a couple of your therapists. They are amazing. One of Brandy, my daughter, saw her when we were going through some transitions. And again, my daughter walked away from that liking the idea of having this unbiased person hear them out, validate what she was saying, and then having a chance to communicate with me as the parent. Hey, here's what you weren't hearing when I was talking to you. So I think it's great to, have that's kind of third party who's there to give them that support and that validation. But want to thank you guys again for coming and having this discussion. This will be one of many, so hope to have you guys back. Again, thank you for lending your voice to the topic. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in to In the Know on WEFT 90.1. Tonight's show will be archived on radiofreeamerica.com, my personal Facebook page, Sherry Williamson, and on Tumblr at In the Know 217. Next week, we're going to be discussing parent engagement, which mental health is going to come into that play, but how parents can engage with the school system. Again, maybe knowing your school social worker, those types of things, getting to know how to engage as a parent so you're more effective with the application that you have for your kids. So thank you again to my guests. I'm glad we had a chance to have this discussion.